Jimi Hendrix's teacher broke his guitar in front of the whole class and said, "You'll never be a musician." 10 years later, she showed up backstage at his Seattle concert. What happened next left everyone in tears. It was October 1957 at Washington Junior High School in Seattle. 15-year-old Jimi Hendrix sat in the back of Mrs. Patricia Morrison's music class, trying to be invisible. He'd brought his guitar to school, a cheap acoustic his father had finally let him keep after years of taking it away whenever Jimi played left-handed. Mrs. Morrison was teaching the class about proper musical technique, about reading sheet music, about the right way to approach music as a discipline. Jimi wasn't paying attention. He was quietly fingering chord shapes on his guitar, not making sound but practicing the positions, lost in his own world. "Mr. Hendrix," Mrs. Morrison's voice cut through the classroom, "are you listening?" Jimi looked up, startled. "Yes, ma'am." "Then why are you playing with that thing instead of paying attention to the lesson?" "I wasn't playing it. I was just—" "Bring it here, now." The classroom went silent. 25 students watched as Jimi reluctantly walked to the front of the class, guitar in hand. He'd been in trouble with Mrs. Morrison before. She didn't like that he couldn't read music. She didn't like that he played by ear instead of following proper technique. Most of all, she didn't like that he insisted on playing left-handed with the guitar strung backwards.
"This is exactly what I'm talking about," Mrs. Morrison said, taking the guitar from Jimi's hands. She held it up for the class to see. "This student thinks he can ignore the fundamentals. He thinks he can just pick up an instrument and play however he wants, with no training, no discipline, no respect for proper technique." Jimi stood there, humiliated, as his classmates snickered. "You play left-handed, don't you?" Mrs. Morrison asked. "Yes, ma'am, I'm left-handed, so the guitar is meant to be played right-handed. That's how it was designed. That's how proper musicians play it. But you insist on doing it wrong." "But I can't play it the other way. I've tried." "You haven't tried hard enough. And that's your problem, James. You take shortcuts. You refuse to learn the proper way. You think you can just feel your way through music without understanding theory, without reading notation, without discipline." Mrs. Morrison walked back to her desk, still holding Jimi's guitar. He thought she was just going to keep it, maybe give it back at the end of class. But then she did something that would haunt her for the next 10 years. She held the guitar over her head and smashed it down on the corner of her desk. The neck cracked, the body splintered, strings snapped and whipped through the air. The sound echoed through the classroom like a gunshot. Students gasped, someone screamed. Jimi stood frozen, unable to process what he'd just witnessed.
Mrs. Morrison handed the broken pieces back to Jimi. "Music is not your future, James. You have no natural talent. You have no discipline. You refuse to learn properly. I'm doing you a favor by telling you this now before you waste years chasing an impossible dream. Focus on something realistic. Find a trade. Music is for people who are willing to do the work and follow the rules. You are neither." Jimi took the broken guitar, his hands shaking. He didn't cry. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. But something inside him broke along with that guitar. Not his dream, but his trust in authority. His belief that teachers wanted to help students. His willingness to accept other people's definitions of possible and impossible. He walked out of the classroom without being dismissed. Mrs. Morrison didn't stop him. That night, Jimi tried to repair the guitar with wood glue and tape, but it was beyond saving. He hid the pieces in his closet because he couldn't stand to throw them away, and he made a promise to himself. He would prove Mrs. Morrison wrong. Not for her, for himself. The next day, Jimi's father, Al Hendrix, got called to the school. Mrs. Morrison explained that Jimi had been disruptive, disrespectful, unwilling to learn. She recommended he be removed from music class permanently. Al, who'd never fully supported Jimmy's musical ambitions anyway, agreed. "Boy's got his head in the clouds," Al said. "Maybe it's better he focuses on practical things." So Jimmy was removed from music class. But every day after school, he'd find a guitar, borrowed, rented, whatever he could get his hands on, and practice. Not the proper way. His way. Years passed. Army, discharge, years of struggle, playing backup for R&B singers, sleeping in doorways, going hungry. But in 1966, he went to London and became Jimi Hendrix. The experience formed. Platinum records, Monterey, Woodstock, guitar god status. Back in Seattle, Mrs. Patricia Morrison followed Jimmy's career in the newspapers with growing horror. She saw his face on magazine covers. She heard his songs on the radio. She watched him on television. And every time she remembered that October day in 1957 when she'd broken a 15-year-old boy's guitar and told him he'd never be a musician. At first, she tried to rationalize it. He'd gotten lucky. Or maybe he'd eventually learned proper technique. Or maybe the standards for popular music were just lower than for real music. But deep down, she knew the truth. She'd been completely, devastatingly wrong. And worse, she'd been cruel. Mrs. Morrison retired from teaching in 1965, the guilt eating at her. She couldn't stand before students preaching about dreams when she'd crushed a boy's dream because it didn't fit her narrow view. In September 1968, when Jimmy's Seattle homecoming concert was announced, she knew she had to apologize. She bought a ticket, more than she'd ever spent on a concert, and brought something she'd kept for 11 years – the broken guitar neck. She'd kept it in her desk drawer as a reminder of her failure as an educator. September 8, 1968, Seattle Center Coliseum, 15,000 screaming fans. Mrs. Morrison, now 61, sat feeling out of place among the teenagers in psychedelic clothing. After the concert, after Jimmy had stopped the show for the blind girl, after the standing ovations, after the encore performances that had the crowd screaming for more, Mrs. Morrison made her way to the backstage area. Security stopped her immediately, of course.
"I need to see Jimi Hendrix," she said. "Ma'am, everyone wants to see him. You can't just—" "I'm his former teacher. I need to apologize to him for something I did 11 years ago." The security guard looked skeptical, but something about this elderly woman's earnestness made him pause. "Wait here," he said. He went backstage and, not knowing what else to do, actually mentioned it to Jimmy's manager. "There's an old lady out here says she was Jimmy's teacher, says she needs to apologize for something." The manager was about to dismiss it, but Jimmy overheard. "A teacher from Seattle? What does she look like?" The security guard described her. Jimmy's face changed. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly. Then louder, "Bring her back. I want to see her." 5 minutes later, Mrs. Patricia Morrison was standing in a backstage hallway face to face with Jimi Hendrix for the first time in 11 years. He was wearing a wild, psychedelic outfit, his afro huge, his presence commanding. She was in a simple dress, clutching her purse and the piece of broken guitar neck, looking small and old. They stared at each other for a long moment. Jimmy's manager and bandmates were nearby, curious about who this woman was. Mrs. Morrison spoke first. Her voice was shaking. "Mr. Hendrix, Jimmy, I don't know if you remember me." "I remember you." His tone was neutral, revealing nothing. "I'm so sorry." The words burst out of her like they'd been trapped inside for a decade. "I'm so sorry for what I did to you, for what I said to you. I was wrong. I was so wrong." She pulled the broken guitar neck from her purse. I kept this. I don't know why. Maybe as a reminder of my failure. Maybe because I knew someday I'd have to face what I'd done. She held it out to him. I broke your guitar. I broke your confidence. I told you that you'd never be a musician, that you had no talent, that you should give up. And I was wrong about everything. Tears were streaming down her face now. I spent the last 10 years watching you become everything I said you couldn't be. Every time I saw your picture in a magazine, every time I heard your music on the radio, I thought about that day in my classroom. I thought about how I crushed a 15-year-old boy's dreams because he didn't learn the way I wanted him to learn. She was sobbing now, barely able to get the words out. I'm a teacher. I'm supposed to nurture talent, not destroy it. I'm supposed to help students find their path, not block it because it doesn't match my narrow view of how things should be. And I failed you. I failed as a teacher. I failed as a human being. And I am so sorry. The hallway was silent, except for her crying. Jimmy's manager and bandmates were watching, not sure what was happening, but understanding it was significant. Jimmy took the broken guitar neck from her hands. He looked at it for a long moment, turning it over, examining it. Then he looked back at Mrs. Morrison. "You know what this is?" he asked, holding up the broken neck. Mrs. Morrison nodded, still crying. "It's the guitar I destroyed. It's proof of what I did to you." "No," Jimmy said softly. "It's the guitar that taught me the most important lesson I ever learned." Mrs. Morrison looked confused. "That day," Jimmy continued, "when you broke my guitar and told me I'd never be a musician, you taught me something valuable. You taught me that the people who are supposed to support you will sometimes try to stop you. You taught me that authority figures can be wrong. You taught me that I'd have to believe in myself even when everyone else doubted me." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "You didn't break me, Mrs. Morrison. You made me stronger. Because after that day, nothing anyone said could hurt me. If I could survive having my guitar smashed and being told I had no talent by someone I was supposed to trust, I could survive anything."
Mrs. Morrison was crying harder now. "But I hurt you! I know I hurt you!" "Yeah," Jimmy admitted. "You did. It hurt a lot. For a long time, I was angry at you. Sometimes I fantasized about proving you wrong, about rubbing my success in your face. But then I realized something. You were doing the best you could with what you understood. You genuinely believed you were helping me by telling me the truth as you saw it. You were wrong, but you weren't evil." He handed the guitar neck back to her. "Keep it or throw it away. But stop carrying the guilt. I forgave you years ago. The only person who hasn't forgiven you is you." Mrs. Morrison took the guitar neck back, holding it like it was precious. "How can you be so kind to me after what I did?" Jimmy shrugged. "Because holding on to anger hurts me more than it hurts you. Because you came here to apologize, which takes courage. And because I remember what it's like to be wrong about someone. I've judged people too. I've made mistakes. If I can't forgive others, how can I expect to be forgiven?" He reached out and hugged her. Mrs. Morrison, this elderly woman who'd once been his tormentor, collapsed into his arms, sobbing. Jimmy held her while she cried, this strange scene playing out in a backstage hallway while roadies carried equipment past them. When she finally pulled away, Mrs. Morrison wiped her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for being a better person than I was." "You want to know the really crazy thing?" Jimmy asked. "What?" "You were right about one thing. I don't read music. I never learned proper technique. I do everything wrong according to classical training, but that's what makes my sound unique. If I'd learned the proper way like you wanted me to, I might have been a decent guitarist,
but I wouldn't have been me." He smiled. "So in a weird way, you pushing me away from traditional education forced me to develop my own style. I'm not saying what you did was right, but maybe things happened the way they needed to happen." Mrs. Morrison laughed through her tears. "You're a remarkable person, Jimi Hendrix. I'm just someone who plays guitar," he said. "And you're just someone who cares enough to apologize for a mistake you made 11 years ago. That makes you pretty remarkable, too." They talked for another 20 minutes. Mrs. Morrison told him she'd quit teaching partly because of what she'd done to him. Jimi told her that was sad, that she could have used that experience to become a better teacher, to understand that talent comes in many forms, to learn that a teacher's job is to nurture, not to judge. Before she left, Jimi signed a copy of his album for her. He wrote, "To Mrs. Morrison, thank you for teaching me that people who say never are usually wrong. Keep believing in your students, even when they don't fit your expectations. Especially then, Jimi." Mrs. Morrison left the arena that night feeling lighter than she'd felt in years. She'd carried that guilt for a decade, and Jimi had lifted it in minutes. Not because he excused what she'd done, but because he'd grown beyond it and invited her to do the same. 2 years later, when Jimi died, Mrs. Morrison was devastated. She wrote a letter to Al Hendrix, expressing her condolences and telling him what had happened that night backstage. She wanted Al to know that his son had been not just talented, but deeply compassionate. Al wrote back, thanking her for the letter and sharing it at a memorial service. People who'd known Jimi weren't surprised. This was who he'd always been, someone who'd experienced cruelty and responded with kindness, who'd been hurt and chose forgiveness.
Mrs. Morrison lived another 15 years. She spent them volunteering at schools, working with students who struggled with traditional learning methods, advocating for arts education, and telling anyone who would listen about the boy whose guitar she'd broken and who'd grown up to teach her the real meaning of education. She kept that broken guitar neck until she died in 1985. In her will, she requested it be donated to the Jimi Hendrix Museum in Seattle with a note, "This is a reminder that teachers can be wrong, students can prove you wrong, and both can grow from that experience if there's forgiveness." The guitar neck is still there, displayed with Jimi's handwritten note to Mrs. Morrison and her letter of apology. It's one of the museum's most visited exhibits, not because of the object itself, but because of the story it represents. A story about a teacher who made a terrible mistake and a student who succeeded despite it. About judgment and forgiveness, about how the people who try to stop you can sometimes, inadvertently, be exactly the push you need to prove them wrong. Mrs. Patricia Morrison broke Jimi Hendrix's guitar and told him he'd never be a musician. She was wrong, and 10 years later, she learned that sometimes being wrong is the best thing that can happen, if you're brave enough to admit it and lucky enough to be forgiven. If this story of forgiveness and growth moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who was told they'd never succeed and proved everyone wrong. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to believe in you? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video for more untold stories of triumph and humanity from music's greatest legends.